Thank you so much, Damien, and welcome everyone to Black Mental Health Matters in MS. I am Dr. Evelyn Hunter. I'm a licensed psychologist and owner of Auburn Psychological Wellness Center and also an assistant professor counseling psychology at Auburn University. I am so excited to be with you all today to talk a little bit about why Black mental health matters in MS. And today we'll really just be focusing on the strategies to promote living well with MS. So let's jump right in. So I'll be using a lot of language today like good mental health or mental health difficulties or good mental health wellness. And I want us to all be on the same page about what I'm talking about. So when I talk about good mental health, I'm talking about feeling good about ourselves, being able to meet the demands of life, feeling like we're able to meet the demands of living with MS in a healthy way, feeling like we're able to express our emotions and be optimistic. And then using those health skills like stress management, decision-making, conflict resolution actively in our lives. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So I'll also be talking a little bit about what mental health difficulties or mental health problems. And that generally is, struggling to share our feelings or emotions, feeling like we're controlled by our emotions or we're overly negative about life, having difficulties accepting change or feeling like stress is controlling our life, or just having difficulty engaging conflict as we deal interpersonally with our family or friends or coworkers, etc. So now that we're all on the same page, let's go ahead to the next slide. You might be wondering, listen, mental health is not something that I really want to address. And you may hold some myths about mental illness. Now I want to go ahead and combat those myths at the beginning of our time today so that we can all move forward and think through how we can live well. So the first myth about mental illness is what I call the Superwoman or Superman complex. It's if I have some sort of mental health struggle, it's because of personal weakness. And this myth is really dangerous because it causes us to avoid or deny when we're struggling. It makes it hard for us to reach out to get help. Another myth about mental illness is it's a crazy person syndrome. Okay, so if someone has a mental health difficulty, they're violent or they're dangerous or they're crazy. And in fact, the vast majority of us struggle with some sort of mental health difficulty. About 75% across the lifespan struggle with some sort of mental health difficulty at some point. So it's actually relatively normal to struggle, and it doesn't mean that we're crazy. And then the third really dangerous myth about mental illness is that it makes us defunct or defective. So if I admit to having some sort of mental health struggle, it means I can't take care of myself or I did something wrong. I'm defective in some way. And again, that myth is really dangerous because it moves us away from seeking the care and treatment we might need. Let's go to the next slide. So a lot of patients come in and they're like, look, Dr. Hunter, I respect what you do, but I am really not trying to deal with something else on top of my MS. I have enough to think about already, right? So why should I care about my mental health? I really need to focus on my MS. And I hope by the end of today's session, you realize that your mental health is intimately related to how you can live well with multiple sclerosis. And that's because we all deal with a number of psychosocial stressors in our day-to-day lives. And psychosocial stressors are things like when we have interpersonal difficulties with our family or support networks, difficulties on our jobs, if we have financial stressors. And then for Black folks in particular, things like discrimination or racial stress are another set of psychosocial stressors. And what research shows us is that psychosocial stressors directly impact our mental health. So when we have a number of negative life stressors, they cause things like depression, anxiety. They exacerbate personality concerns that we may already deal with. And then we see in research that our mental health directly impacts our physical health outcomes. So our MS disease severity, how many exacerbations we have, whether or not our treatments are effective are directly impacted by our mental health. And then also what's something we call disease perception, which is how do I feel about the way my MS is going? And so that is directly, so your mental health really matters to the ways in which your physical health is in MS. Let's go to the next slide. The other thing that I think is really important for folks of color and Black folks in particular to think about is something called health disparities. And health disparities are differences in disease burden. And disease burden can be the number of folks that have disease, how severe diseases are. It's differences in disease burden across populations. So across economic or social or environmentally disadvantaged populations. Let's move to the next slide. Unfortunately, Black people in America see health disparities across a number of different illness concerns, and MS is not exempt from those. So Black Americans with MS often have more aggressive disease course. The age of onset tends to be a little bit earlier. Black Americans are less likely to get MS specialized care from neurologists. And that's even after we take into account things like access to healthcare or socioeconomic status. So even Black folks who have the access to the care are less likely to get the care. And the thing about it is that the research hasn't found any underlying biological reasons for these differences that we see in Black folks with MS. So you might be asking, well, then how does like what's happening for me socially end up in my body? How is it manifesting in my body? Let's look at the next slide to find the answer. So we understand how social experiences end up in our biological physical conditions through something called allostatic load. And you can just think of allostatic load as a fancy way to talk about chronic stress. So the allostatic load is like the physiological wear and tear on our body that results from chronic stress exposure. And we measured a bunch of different ways, like through blood pressure or cortisol or C-reactive protein. But the bottom line is chronic stress is how we carry that social stress in our bodies. And when we limit the wear and tear or the chronic stress, we decrease the negative impact in our physical conditions. Let's go to the next slide. We'll go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. Okay, so then back to our question. Dr. Hunter, why should I care about my mental health? Because we can interrupt the stress impact on our physical MS symptoms by engaging good mental health and wellness practice. We can interrupt that connection between the chronic stress and our physical health condition in MS by interrupting and improving our mental health. So let's look at a few ways to do that in our next slide. Oh, I almost forgot. So Black folks are super equipped to interrupt that pathway and to really engage our mental health and wellness because we have a number of community strengths. Let's look at the next slide for those. So community strengths in the Black community in particular, family is life. We have strong family bonds in our community, and that's both our biological families, but sometimes even our chosen families, right? I have a cousin Kiki, and she has not been blood relation to me ever, but she has been my cousin since I was 2, right? So we have strong family bonds. Family is life. God is good. In the Black community, we have a strong religious orientation, and that's not specific to one particular religion, though Christian communities are prevalent in the Black community, but across a number of religious and spiritual communities, Black folks tend to have a very strong religious orientation that is protective for both mental and physical health outcomes. Black girl magic and Black is king. We have a strong racial ethnic identity where we are very proud of our heritage and proud of being Black. And that, again, is really protective against a lot of negative mental health and negative physical health outcomes. We make a way out of no way. We are a resilient community, right? And we engage in a lot of resilience, even when up against some really difficult historical and present conditions, right? I'm on my grind. We have a strong work orientation in the Black community. And that is something that we really have to balance when we think about our MS, because on the one hand, that strong work orientation is really good. And we learn to push through. You got to work twice as hard to get half as far is another part of that achievement and work orientation. On the other hand, it's really important for us to listen to our bodies and rest when we need to with MS. And so balancing those community strengths with what we need to do for ourselves is really important. So let's take a look at the next slide to think about how we use the community strengths to impact our mental health for the better in MS. And the bottom line is we must be intentional. Given what we know about the health disparities in MS, specifically for Black Americans, our wellness must be intentional. So what does intentional wellness look like? The first thing is you have to be on the lookout, and you're probably like, be on the lookout for what? Don't worry, I'll tell you in a minute. The second thing is you need to identify a preventative wellness plan. And a preventative wellness plan are sort of 4 key things that I'll talk you through to get you through, build you up, add to your strength and get support, and then impact systems for change. And the final and very important is to get help. So when we're on the lookout and we identify a preventative wellness plan, sometimes we still need some more additional support. And so we'll talk through some emotional, cognitive, and systems levels help we can get. So let's start with being on the lookout. But for what? Let's talk through a few of the common experiences that sometimes folks with MS may struggle with in terms of mental health difficulties. Next slide. All right, so the first is the natural grief process. And you might notice the natural grief process picking up at diagnosis or after an exacerbation, or even other times if there are losses that you're navigating or differences in your life from the way you might have expected it to be, or from some wishes and hopes and dreams. Sometimes the natural grief process can come into play. And that grief process is pretty well established. And it starts with sort of a denial and the initial reaction to a loss. And then anger about that loss, what I like to call a righteous anger. It's okay to be angry, and sometimes we should be. And then sometimes some bargaining, which might involve, praying, alternative treatments, promising better behavior. And then that natural grief process really hits oftentimes with the depression as we're really grieving the loss, and then sort of culminating in an acceptance. And so that's one thing to be on the lookout for. Am I going through a natural grief process? Let's go to the next slide. Another thing to be on the lookout for is depression. And depression is a set of emotional disorders that involve sort of sadness and a difficulty moving through some of the common things you might do in your life or enjoying the things that you normally enjoy. And there are a couple different ways depression can present. One is a chronic depression where you're sad, but not so sad that you can't function. You're still doing the day-to-day things, but you feel sad all the time, and it lasts for a pretty long time. A year or 2 years. It's hard to remember the last time you were not sad. That's what we call chronic depression. There's also a major depression where you have really low dips, where it's actually very difficult to function or do the day-to-day things. But you come out of those dips to sort of a normalized baseline. And then there's what we call double depression, which is you feel sad many days, most days, but you're able to function. And then you also have the major dips where there are periods of time where you're not able to function in the normal day-to-day ways. Let's go to the next slide. So a lot of folks, especially when they experience depression for the first time, say, listen, I just need to snap out of it, right? I just need to get myself together. And to be honest with you, snapping out of depression is akin to telling yourself to not have a heart attack, right? You don't have control over these things to just talk yourself out of them. So if you're experiencing sadness for longer than 2 weeks, you definitely want to seek help. Let's go to the next slide. All right, another thing to be on the lookout for is some anxiety. And anxiety is a really common mental health difficulty and concern. Some folks have what we call a general anxiety, where there's just a consistent worry about all the things all the time. I feel worried about finances, and I feel worried about my kids, and I feel worried about my job. And I just, one type of worry alleviates, I feel worried about something new. It's a general anxiety. The other type of anxiety that can be really common in MS is a health anxiety. And health anxiety can creep up, especially when we have true health concerns, because in MS, you're often interpreting what's happening with your body, and that can cause some anxiety and concern, right? So you get a little creak in your knee, and you may wonder, is that my MS, and feel some anxiety about that, or is that something else? And so health anxiety is also something that we want to be on the lookout for. And then some folks often also have panic attacks, and panic attacks are relatively common if you have one or two. If you're able to calm yourself down and breathe through your panic attack, and you're not worried about having future panic attacks, we don't typically worry about them. But if you're constantly worried about having additional attacks, that's when we really want to think about what treatment might look like. Let's go to the next slide. And then other difficulties or mental health difficulties that may come up may be trauma, and that could be past trauma or a recent trauma, eating behaviors, overeating or undereating. And that's especially true as many of us, as part of the idea of reaching for holistic health, think about what our eating and food intake looks like with MS. And so making sure that doesn't become a clinical concern. And then again, personality concerns. Let's go to the next slide. So I'm on the lookout for those types of mental health difficulties. And in the process of being on the lookout, I also want to identify a preventative wellness plan. Let's hit the next slide. And I'm going to rely on a comic artist, Deanna Zant, that I really like, to help me work through what a preventative wellness plan might look like. So a preventative wellness plan is 4 things. The first are self-soothing activities. And self-soothing activities are meant to get you through, okay? They're urgent and emergency needs. They're things I can grab quickly, and they're just meant to get me through a high-stress time. The important thing is you don't want to over-rely on self-soothing activities, because they're not going to move you through the stressful condition. They just sort of help you distract in the time that you need to be distracted, so until you can address the more pressing concern. So self-soothing for me is a nice Frappuccino from Starbucks. Self-soothing for some folks are some Netflix binges, some maybe a little comfort food, soul food. Some folks go on walks, exercise. So again, self-soothing are those things that may not be always the best for you, but they help get you through. The second piece of the preventative wellness plan, and probably the most important, is self-care. And self-care is a consistent practice to build you up. So if we think about your wellness as a mountain, self-care is what you do consistently to hike up that mountain. And if we think about a mental health difficulty as a little slip down the mountain, the more consistent you are in your self-care, the higher you will be, even if you slip and fall, right? So if I'm doing no self-care and I'm at the bottom of the mountain, then when I slip, I'm on the ground, right? It's taking me out. But if I could have a consistent practice where I'm slowly hiking up my self-care mountain, then even when I slip and I have a mental health difficulty or a psychosocial struggle, something happens, that I'm still higher up on the mountain, right? And so oftentimes folks with a consistent practice of self-care will find that they have less significant mental health struggles. And so self-care are things like going to therapy, making sure you make your medical appointments, doing a consistent exercise that's somewhat challenging and sort of building for your body, eating well, napping. There's an Instagram called the Nap Ministry. I love it. It talks about the liberatory idea, the freeness of taking naps. So those are all self-care activities that you want to implement consistently and have a consistent practice in your life. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide. All right. So the next piece is community care. And community care are the ways you add to your strength and get support. So community care are things like child care collectives. A lot of folks in the Black community and other communities do co-housing so that we can stretch and share our resources. Community care helps us work around the ways that we work around the systems that aren't always most ideal, right? So how do I work around the fact that childcare is really expensive and sometimes hard to obtain? How do I work around places where healthcare access feels difficult to get? Those are your community care options. And you really want to identify what types of community care I need. We have 3 kids. So when the pandemic hit and all the childcare places closed, I really lean on my community to help get us through, right? So you want to think about, in my life, what type of community care would be really important? And then what type of community care do I enjoy providing? And that reciprocal nature of community care can be really healing on both sides. And then the last type of piece of your preventative wellness plan is structural care. And structural care are the ways we impact the systems for change to make it so that we all need less self-care, right? So that's advocacy for mental health and medical care for folks with MS. That's advocacy for everyone to live well, to have a living wage, for everyone to have access to healthcare. So thinking about the things that you really care about and structures that you want to advocate around to change, to live better with MS or live well with MS. Let's go to the next slide. So other prevention strategies in your sharing your feelings and emotions. So making sure you have someone to trust you can talk to. Using positive self-talk strategies. So we're hardest on ourselves, right? But being as kind to ourselves as we would be to someone else, and making sure we talk to ourselves in the way that we would talk to someone else. And that typically immediately puts us into more positive self-talk. And then again, working with a therapist to learn things like stress management skills, decision-making skills, communication skills, to just strengthen the ways that we prevent mental health difficulty. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so we've been on the lookout for mental health struggles. We have a preventative wellness plan in place, and it's not enough. Well, sometimes we need to get help, and that's okay. And let's talk a little bit about what help might look like. So the first type of help might be help around the emotional impact of living with MS, or the emotional impact of a mental health concern with MS. And what we know from research is the best care is what we call combo therapy. Combo therapy is a mixture of psychotherapy to address the situational, emotional processing pieces of concerns, and psychiatric medication that addresses any chemical imbalance that may be happening. It doesn't mean that you need both all the time or that one is more beneficial than the other, but you want to work with your healthcare provider team, or your treatment team, to think through what might be best to work through sort of the emotional pieces of mental health struggle. Let's go to the next slide. The other type of help that can be that we may need to reach for is help for any cognitive impacts we have. You may hear it called the cog fog, right? And cognitive impacts are interesting because they can be both a symptom of multiple sclerosis, but then also can be due to things like depression or anxiety that can make it hard to concentrate and difficult to think. And so you really want to use a psychologist or a neuropsychologist or neurologist to first get a cognitive assessment, and cognitive assessments help us establish a baseline for where you are, and so that we can monitor where you're going. And then there are also a number of strategies that psychologists can help you work through to improve cognition. And so improving memory, improving attention and concentration, and then improving the way you process information. And the great thing about cognitive strategies is once you learn them, they're yours, right? You don't have to do a lot of therapy or a lot of work to learn them. So once you know that doing crossword puzzles improves memory, you can take that with you for good. Let's go to the next slide. And then finally, the systems impact. And so sometimes you need to go work with someone around, you know, relationships with family and friends. You know, it's sometimes hard or difficult for our loved ones or care partners to understand what it means to live with multiple sclerosis. It may be hard to communicate your needs. And so there can be work around that. Vocational concerns, it may be hard to adjust to what work looks like or doesn't look like. And then financial concerns or legal concerns, especially when dealing with things like ADA, can be ways that we go and do work around treating a system's impact that may be interrupting our mental health. Let's go to the next slide. So the bottom line is, if you're concerned for a loved one or concerned for yourself, really sharing that concern. I care, I love you, I see you, I want you to know that maybe we should talk about what we see going on here. And then being okay to ask some tough questions. Are you feeling depressed? Are you starving yourself? Are you having thoughts of killing yourself? And being able to be honest and then getting to a professional to help facilitate that, and really just removing any shame or doubt around what it means to ask for help. Next slide. And then the questions often, can you recover? Absolutely. Mental illness is not only preventable, but it's also treatable. When you're on the lookout, you identify a preventative wellness plan, get help when you need to. It is completely treatable. And a multidisciplinary approach is going to be the best approach to take. It's a mouthful, right? So engaging your physicians, neurologists, psychiatrists, and general practitioners, your therapists and counselors and psychologists, your OT and PT folks and dietitians, and anyone else on your treatment team, so that you can really approach things from a holistic way. It's going to be the best you can do for your multiple sclerosis.